Hello, my name's Roger Watson. I'm the Editor-in-Chief of the Journal of Advanced Nursing, and welcome to the JAN podcast. These occasional podcasts will be a miscellany of my reflections on working as an Editor-in-Chief, some hot topics in academic publishing, and occasional contributions from guest editors. This is the JAN podcast of 8th of September 2017. Continuing our podcast series about myths in academic publishing, I want to look today very briefly at the issue of citations. Recently, in the Times Higher Education newspaper, there was an article about some academics who'd got together and developed an S-index. And the S-index was a measure of how frequently academics cited themselves. The impression conveyed in the article was that citing yourself was a bad thing. It did say in the article, too much self-citation. However, how much is enough and when is it permitted? And there's no answer to this. The point the academics were trying to make was that too much self-citation increased your overall citations and could eventually have an influence on the itch index. I'm not entirely sure why such an index is required, other than to isolate the practice of self-citation. Inevitably there will be league tables presented and names will be named, but the point is that on the Scopus database, where you can check your citations and your itch index, you can find your citations with and without self-citation. Usually the itch index is only changed, in my experience, by a factor of one itch index number, and on the Web of Science, if you exclude self-citation, you don't get an itch index at all. I suppose it's not beyond the technology of the Web of Science to develop another itch index. However, your itch index on the Web of Science explicitly includes self-citation. I suppose it's quite easy to check self-citation if you find articles in Google Scholar and then see who's been citing them. However, you have to cite yourself sometimes. If you're working in a field where you're one of the people who's doing a major piece of research and you're following on from research that you've done before, it would be absolutely wrong not to cite that work. People need to see the pedigree of the work and the provenance of that work. So citing yourself isn't wrong, but of course putting in gratuitous self-citations is completely wrong. So I really don't want people to get the impression that citing themselves is a bad thing. It's a necessity in some cases, but excessive, which is difficult to define of course, excessive self-citation could well be a bad thing. I did have a colleague once who said that whenever she reviewed papers for journals, if she realised that the author was citing him or herself, she immediately rejected the article. I didn't quite understand this because, first of all, if it's a double-blind peer review system, she shouldn't have known if the person was citing themselves or not, and why would that automatically lead to a rejection of the paper? If you think the self-citation is gratuitous or unnecessary or excessive, then that's a comment that you can make. The other aspect of the citation myth is that people say you have to cite the journal to which you are sending an article. Now, it may well be a good thing to cite that journal, and it's not unusual that you would, because in your field they're very likely to have published the work that you're either following on from or reporting. You may well be submitting a systematic review to a journal where the majority of that work has been done. You can't help citing it. It's not a good thing or a bad thing. It's certainly not something that should help an article to be published, and it's not something that should preclude an article from being published if you haven't cited that journal. However, clearly, if you are writing for a specific journal, you are just as well to check to see if they do have articles in that field. That's a very sensible thing to do, and there's nothing wrong with that. However, if you're ever enticed, induced, or instructed by an editor at any point in a review process, or if it's stated explicitly on a journal web page that you should, where possible, try to cite that journal, this is entirely wrong, and it's against the COPE, the Committee on Publication Ethics, guidelines. Most publishers are signed up to that and monitor this very carefully. However, there are some publishers who are not signed up to COPE, where this still exists. Recently, a few colleagues and I discovered this on a journal website around a paper that we were submitting, which we did in fact submit and which has eventually been accepted, and we reported it to the publishers and to Cope. The publishers' response was that they apologised and they thought that they'd asked their editors to take that down off all the web pages, and Cope's answer was that the journal wasn't in fact registered with them, so they couldn't make any comment. So, just to recap briefly, citing yourself isn't wrong, citing a journal isn't necessary, and being asked to cite a journal by an editor is entirely unacceptable. Thanks very much for listening.
This podcast was produced in association with youpublicationslimited.com.